Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Mr. John M Olsen, introduce himself to our listeners and viewers at home.
Hi there. I'm John M Olsen. I am a primarily science fiction author, although I've dabbled in fantasy as well. I have written something over 40 or 50 short stories. I also edit novels for other authors. I think I'm somewhere over 50 on that count. So I have a lot of fun with the writing industry. I've been the president of the League of Utah Writers. So I'm involved in the community. I like giving back to that community that's been so welcoming to me.
That is cool. Utah seems to be the place for writers. Brandon Sanderson put you guys on the map. Or maybe it's BYU's writing program. I don't know.
Yeah, there have been several high-profile authors that came through that writing program.
Yeah, it's I don't remember even hearing about it till Brandon Sanderson made it big. But then you started hearing other people like, "Oh yeah, I went there too."
Well, I think Stephanie Myers is one of them.
I think what it was is people didn't talk about it as much because, religion can be such a polarizing thing, and there's automatically assumption that you're Mormon if you went to BYU, and so they kind of just didn't say. And I think when Brandon Sanderson came out of the woodworks, like, "Yeah, I went there," and then he started doing the classes that he would teach on creative writing that he filmed for people that couldn't pay there for free. And then suddenly people are like, "Oh, this is kind of good stuff." So good for him.
Yeah, I think a lot of that came from Dave Farland being there teaching at BYU.
Okay. I've heard that name, but I don't know why. I mean, obviously he's probably a writer if he's teaching.
Yeah, he passed away from an accident about, 4 years ago or so, but very big in the writing community and also very generous with his time.
That's good. You try to pay it forward because, we all had help in the beginning. Some people's beginning like mine just stretch on and on and on because, I got to get the sales there first before I tell anyone how to do anything. And even then I'll probably be too busy. So instead I'll just write and, my therapy can become your reading enjoyment. But the next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we first found them. So this one's actually rather simple. I was at a poker game and I actually won John. Like somebody was like, "Yeah, I've read all his books. I'm kind of done with him here. You can have them." But hey, I mean, it was a great investment because you've got at least a trilogy out of him and then 50 short stories. So before we get started, though, sir, we do have to do the religion question. Are you ready for this?
I am ready. I hope.
All right, Stargate, Babylon 5, or Battlestar Galactica?
I think a Babylon 5 series would have to win that one.
Okay.
Of course, it's a little old school now. The graphics don't hold up quite so well, but the story is great.
And the acting was actually relatively good, all things considered. So, and because we're polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, the Game of Thrones, Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia?
I think I'm going to have to go with Narnia on that one. That's a kind of a fun one because I like the way he integrates theology without it being overbearing. It's a great story.
Okay. Did you like the movie adaptations? There's been a couple efforts to do that.
I think they did fairly well. I mean, there's always going to be differences. Sometimes you have to kind of separate them and say, that's a great movie. That's a great book. Let's pretend they don't have anything to do with each other.
Yeah. You see that a lot when people talk about the various series, but you kind of have to make allowances when you're crossing mediums because you have access. Like I can talk about inner monologues in a book. It's kind of hard to do that. I mean, if they're a really good actor with facial expressions, but I mean, that's not as nuanced as, his exact thoughts. And I thought about this. I got a tattoo when I got out of the Army. And one of the things the tattoo artist, because I was based on an image drawn for me by a friend of mine who didn't make it. So it was originally we were going to do unit t-shirts I promise I'm going somewhere with this, dear listener. We're going to do unit t-shirts, our unit crest on the front, and then our like personalized logo big on the back. And then when he didn't make it, I got the personalized part tattooed. And when I brought that art to the tattoo artist, he's like, you know, JR, I've got to be honest with you. Not all art translates from flat to curved, you know, because it's on your body. It's like you have to make allowances for the changing platform. Otherwise, if I draw this exactly as it is and I don't adjust accordingly, it's going to look stupid. It's going to look like I messed it up. And so I kind of thought about that. I'm like, I bet that applies when you're talking about movies to games to books to whatever, because different mediums have different strengths. And you can't, like, if you try to shoehorn it in, sometimes you do more harm than good by not factoring that in.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm one of those crossovers where I've done a lot of different things. I actually spent 7 years in the video game industry as well.
Okay. I've spent at least that playing video games, so that counts. It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
I mean, I've got enough hours on Skyrim. I practically got a PhD in it. Fallout 2.
Yeah, what is it? You're supposed to spend 1,000 hours at something to be an expert?
There you go. I'm an expert at Skyrim and Fallout. So basically, if it's the 1950s inspired post-apocalypse, I'm kind of your guy. So I know all the things and killed all the people. But, you know, you do learn when people play those kind of games. You can learn a lot about their character by what faction they align themselves with in these various games.
Right. Yeah, how you play something is determined by the player an awful lot in some of these, especially the more free-form games where it's more of an open world.
So is that what you were doing, the free flow stuff, or were you doing more of the linear storytelling like a Dragon Age or, I don't know, Halo?
I spent most of my time doing sports.
Okay.
And so the old PlayStation Jet Moto game, for instance.
Okay. So were you doing the coding or the storytelling for it?
The coding on it. Yeah, I'm a gearhead through and through.
Cool. Way above me. I always get a kick out, though. Sometimes those, you know, the happy little accidents that Ross told us, the great painter. And then you see about like the first Pong game that it kept getting faster and faster the longer you lasted. That was not intended. They've actually interviewed the guy that made that game. That was actually a glitch, and we were going to fix it, but everyone liked it so much that we just left it and pretended we did it on purpose. Sometimes, you know, fate just finds a way. So, all right. Because this is a Blaster Blaze, we do have more than just those two questions. So, what is your favorite dinosaur?
My favorite dinosaur is going to have to be the Stegosaurus. And yeah, there's a reason behind that, and it's the Thagomizer. I don't know if you're familiar with the Thagomizer story.
I am, but readers might not, so you can spill it.
Okay, Steve Larson wrote a comic, and he had some cavemen standing up front. One of them was saying that you had to beware of this dinosaur's Thagomizer because it was named after the late Thag Simmons, who had been smashed to smithereens because he had an interaction with the dinosaur. And so the scientists saw this comic and they thought, you know, that thing doesn't have a name yet, so let's just roll with it. And so the official name of that spiky thing on the end of the Stegosaurus's tail was officially named Thagomizer. And so
one of the cool parts of that story that you missed, though, is part of how they even knew about it, because it was the Far Side comics. And he reached out when he was making that comic to somebody that worked at the in a paleontology department. I don't remember if it was the National Museums or if it was a college, but he asked specifically, hey, does this have a name? And when they said no, he just went with the Thagomizer. And then they're like, hey, I wonder why he asked. And they checked him out and found it and then went with it. So he started the interaction unintentionally by just trying to do some research before he did his thing, which I think is kind of cool.
Yeah, so that story has always been really a lot of fun to me to see those sorts of things happen where you just have a comic artist who is influencing scientific discovery and research methods.
Yeah, and I really dig it because, you know, like I said, most of us grew up where, you know, you get the calendar with the comic a day and it's like one for every day of the week. Or day of the year, and it's like a lot of the comic ones, like the Far Side did it. Beetle Bailey had one for a while. Like some of the classic comics that you'd get on the Sunday morning papers would have these calendars, and so that's I grew up looking at those comics, and so it always amuses me. And some of it's almost like he predicted the future. He was right up there with Star Trek, and probably because he was a Trekkie, but like some of those stories that he came up with, and I'm like, wait, no, did they know something we don't know? Because now you look back at those comics from like the 80s and 90s, and they were kind of right about some of it. Although the joke is probably they thought they were being absurdist, and it would never happen.
Yeah, sure this is so far out there. Nobody would ever do this. Well, yeah. You never go broke by underestimating the stupidity of people sometimes.
Yeah, there's that famous quote that I think it's Tommy Lee Jones was the actor in Men in Black. He's like, a person is smart, but people are stupid.
Right.
He kind of nailed it. And that was the invention we don't have yet, but we definitely need is that one little thing where they flash the light in front of you.
Flashy, yeah.
You know, they can make you forget because, I mean, I'd like to reset some people's minds a little bit out there. But all right, and this is one that's off the cuff. I did not prepare you for this because normally we don't ask it if we ask the dinosaur question. But what is your favorite zoo animal?
My favorite what?
Zoo animal.
Yeah, my ears are kind of playing tricks on me. I'm not sure what you were saying.
Your favorite zoo animal?
A zoo animal. Okay. Yeah. I think I suffered from too much nearby gunfire when I was a teenager or something. Favorite zoo animal? I would say the rhinoceroses are a lot of fun. I got an opportunity to go on a safari in Africa, just a picture-taking safari. And the guide showed us this boulder sitting out right beside the road, and the top of the rock was shiny for some reason. He said, oh yeah, that's where the rhinoceros will just come over, stand on top of it, and rub his stomach back and forth on this rock. And I thought, oh, okay, that sounds kind of cool. So I like rhinoceroses. I guess it's not rhinoceri.
All I know is rhinoceroses are just fat unicorns.
Right. I mean, they sometimes have two horns on the front, so they don't really qualify as unicorns.
I guess if they had the two, they would just be deformed unicorns, because I don't think I've seen that. Most of the ones you see in the pictures are just the one horn.
Yeah, they have the big one. I guess a lot of caretakers out in these wilds of Africa will sedate them and cut off their horns so poachers don't go after them anymore.
That's sad. They have to do that. I mean, at some point in time, those horns were developed from if you believe in the Darwinian evolutionary kind of perspective, those horns were developed for a purpose that served their evolutionary needs. So to take it off, they're just like, I don't know, it just seems wrong, messing with Mother Nature.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind people hunting, like eat what you kill what you eat, whatever. But poaching, just to say you bag something that you'll do nothing with, just
yeah, the trophy hunting, no.
I mean, take a trophy. Like, I don't have a problem with even people hunt deer and then take the trophy and hang the head or the antlers or whatever. But those people are hunting it to eat it.
Yeah, you better like venison if you're going to go out trophy hunting for deer.
Right, and I don't know that anyone actually eats rhinos. Probably a little bit tough. Gamey meat, if we're being honest, but I don't like the killing it just for the sport of it. That's just always rubbed me as wrong. Although the safari just to take pictures sounds like that could be fun. Are you a huge photog type? Like you take pictures all the time?
Not really. It was just a business trip, and we had a weekend to spare, and we were in South Africa. And so we found a tour guide, and he drove us up to one of the reserves, and we saw lions and elephants and giraffes and all kinds of stuff.
Cool. All right. And because we are sponsored by the Coffee Brand Coffee Company, we do have to ask this question, but we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters of Blades podcast. We are no longer knuckle-dragging troglodytes. So coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
I think I'm going to have to twist the rules a little bit. If people have watched me on your podcast before, I'm going to go with cocoa, but it has to have the whipped cream and sprinkles on top to kind of enhance it.
That's cool. They actually sell the Coffee Brand Coffee also has hot chocolate. I've been drinking their s'mores version of it. when I need to mix it up. But aside from that, normally I don't drink the hot chocolate except for in the winter. I'll drink hot coffee year round, but in the winter, I mean, I don't really tend to want hot chocolate in the summer. I don't know. That's just seems like a seasonal drink to me. So, obviously you've worked in tech, so you've got like a sciencey, well, you got a STEM background. What got you into writing?
Well, it was a friend of mine, Jay Barnson. He had been talking to some people about a particular anthology. It was like put forward almost like it was a contest. Just, okay, here's, you already submit it. A typical call for short stories now that I look back on it, but it sounded like it was set up almost like a contest. And he was submitting stories to this particular publisher. And so I figured, well, that sounds kind of fun. So I decided to start writing some of these short stories for a very targeted kind of a story for the anthologies, because most of them have a very specific theme. And I hadn't had anything published since a short story back in the late 1900s, as I like to put it. It was, I think, 1990 or so. I had a short story that appeared in Internet World magazine, of all things. And so I hadn't done writing for a long time. So I decided, well, I'll get back into it. I submitted a couple of stories, didn't get into a couple of anthologies. Then I finally did get into one on with a theme of steampunk. And that was a lot of fun. And so I figured, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And so I started writing a lot more stories, submitting them a lot more places. So I kind of cut my teeth on short stories and then made the transition into novels from there. I had to go through all the learning process of, a novel is not just a longer form of a short story. All of those things with the structural elements and all those things. But being a software engineer, you give me a rule set and I can own that rule set. And so you tell me, okay, here's the differences between novels and short stories. I think, oh, okay, point 1, point 2, point 3, I've got this. And so I kind of transitioned over. And so I have been not doing as many short stories lately. But that's kind of how I got my start, is through the short story arena.
That's how I started reading. I was what they call a tag along when my sisters did the Girl Scouts. I was too young for Boy Scouts yet, but the girls were old enough to do the Girl Scouts. So I went to a couple of the events, and I was young enough through Girls Cooties, but they had Reader's Digest books there for the tag-alongs, which is just a fancy word for the siblings that go but aren't a member, which is where they got the name for the cookie, by the way. And so I was reading like short stories. There was a lot of the classic pulpy kind of science fiction, like from its heyday. We're talking like Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, that kind of stuff. But it was condensed and then made kind of palatable for kids. And so that's how I started reading, with short content. So I've always been kind of passionate about it. I wish it was more profitable and more in vogue now than it used to be. But given the price, I think everyone just wants to feel like they're getting their dollar's worth. And so it makes more sense to them to buy a Chonkin novel than it does a short story. Mm-hmm. It's like a tenth the size, which I totally get. Like as a consumer, I'm with you. But it is a shame that the art form isn't as prevalent as it used to be.
Right.
I could actually write the same 10,000 words, because the average short story is, from a professional standpoint, 4 is the low end. Most do 6 to 10,000 words. I could write the same 10,000 words in a novel easily in 3-4 days. Take that short story. Sometimes that same 10,000 words could take me 2 weeks. It's harder to write short stories for me than it is to write the novel, because you have less words to play with.
Uh-huh.
And so you got to make everything kind of do double duty. Was it short stories that you started reading as well, or did you start with some other way to discover speculative fiction?
Well, one of the things that got me started when I was a teenager was my dad's library. He didn't really have short story collections in his library, but I just devoured book after book from there. And he didn't really segregate things by genre. And so there was this wall of books that was science fiction and fantasy and Western and thriller and all these different things. And so I kind of dove in. During the summer, I would come up to eat every once in a while. And otherwise I would be down just reading through the library. And so I had a lot of fun with that. I got through. My dad had a lot of the classics, like the Thomas Covenant stuff. For fantasy, he had all of Isaac Asimov's science fiction stories. So I had the Robots and Empire and all those sorts of things. And it was kind of funny because I reread some of those Asimov books not too, just like 4 or 5 years ago. And the books had transformed from what I had remembered in my head, because as a teenager, I had all these long, boring stretches before it got back to the action stuff that I was really interested in. And as an adult, when I reread that, I couldn't find the long, boring stretches anymore.
I get that. So with the writing, like I think younger readers don't appreciate kind of some of these experiences, partly because if you think about it, like when we were going to the library, you couldn't just go online and buy the digital book. Like you had to find a physical copy, and buying the books could get expensive, but the library was free. Well, your tax dollars paid for it. And so you'd go to the library, but you were limited by whatever books were in your city library system. There were interlibrary loans, but it wasn't as accessible as it is now, because I think online lets you coordinate a lot better. Like they might know the local colleges or something, but you're not, going halfway across the state to borrow a book anymore. And so once you finish the genre you like, if it's sci-fi or fantasy or whatever, and you've read the entire library system, you're like, well, shit, I guess I'm going to read something else in a different genre. And so you ended up reading more broadly, I think, than people nowadays with the digital stuff, because you can narrow your niche so small that even your genre you'll miss, because you're only reading like Space Marine stories, not even Space Fleet stories. You're only reading the Space Marine stories because you can drill it down that much. I do think there's value in the more broad reading, though.
Definitely. Yeah, having gone through that library and getting the science fiction, the fantasy, and even tossing in some Tom Clancy and stuff like that, having that broad background gives you a knowledge base to draw upon. That's one of the things. I have some presentations that I will give from time to time to different writing groups. And one of the things that I talk about is how the broader your knowledge base, the deeper your writing is going to be. And so you have the opportunity to put together things that somebody that doesn't read broadly might even not be able to find the relationship between. And so, yeah, I'm a big fan of reading and reading fairly broadly. Now, one year I decided I'm going to read some of the classics. And so it's like Ben Franklin's autobiography, for instance. So things like that.
Yeah, and autobiographies can be fun. Although you got to remember, like the historian in me, like those are still curated stories. Like, famously the Franklins burnt letters that they thought might not put him in the best light. So the stuff that survives is the stuff they wanted to survive. So there's nuance in there, but there's definitely value, I think, in revisiting not just other genres and other eras of books. Like a book that's published in the 50s is going to be different than a book published in the 70s, which is going to be different because, there are representations, there are time capsule of the era in which they were written. And so the themes of a book written at the height of the Vietnam War is going to be different than the themes of a book written at the height of World War II or the Korean War.
Yeah, the themes people pick on tend to have something to do with the current era, even though it's presented in the light of some other time period, whether it's in the future or the past.
I was going somewhere with that, but train left the station. That's what happens when you get blown up too many times. So yeah, I think there's value in reading not just broadly in a cultural sense, but also broadly in an era, like when the books are written. And there was something about the history stuff, but that probably bored people anyway, so we'll just move on. All right, we're going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly shill for the man, and then we're going to come and talk about the books that brought us here, and you can start sharing this awesome world. So we're going to pause for a moment.
Across 1,000 battlefields and 1,000,000 wars, there is always a question. What do you do when all the chips are on the table? Do you run? Try to find salvation in the arms of an easy peace? Or do you stand and fight and send your enemies into whatever hole they crawled out of? On Deadly Ground, a heroic Last Stand anthology, has 10 stories addressing that question. Each character faces the impossible in different ways, but all will be tested before the day is done. Can they earn a heroic victory amongst the endless eternity of space, or are they doomed to fall into obscurity?
All right. Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. And with that, we are back. So first, I'm going to throw the book one cover up, but can you tell us where the idea for the Polecat Protocol came from? Like, where was the genesis of the universe?
One of the things that I was thinking about as I read other science fiction stories is how space travel works. And so, yeah, a typical story, you have a character in a setting with a problem. And so I started off kind of looking at that setting issue. And I thought, okay, what can you do to make space travel dangerous or unpredictable or difficult in some way? Yeah, if you can just hop in, drive to the next star, hop out, everything's fine. It doesn't have the same depth and feel as if there's some risk to it every time you decide you want to go somewhere. And so I was looking at, well, how can I do that? And so in this universe, what I set up is there is a fuel that's very rare and difficult to obtain, expensive to refine, but there is a natural source for this fuel. And so you use this fuel to open up kind of a wormhole to jump from one place to the next. The problem is the way you aim your ship is critically important to where you end up. And so if you're off by a degree, well, 1 degree when you're traveling 20 light years is a lot of distance. And so I wanted to play around with that. I like the concept of the hard science fiction story, and so I wanted to get some nice, good nuts and bolts in the background, even though you really have to emphasize the characters of the story to get people to like it. I really do like making sure my science has a good background, even when it's something fantastic like the space travel and how that all works. And so I think I even mentioned very briefly in the story, if I recall correctly, like even if your ship has a little bit of flex to it, that could alter your trajectory on where you come out. And so people have to make shorter jumps to make them safer jumps. And so there's that inherent risk and how much fuel you use, things like that. And so I wanted to take that concept and play with it a little bit for this mode of travel. So that's kind of where the story started. And so that gave me that arena to place the story. And so then I just had to come up with the characters and the problem they ran into.
Okay. So did you intentionally, because you're giving me Age of Sail vibes, the danger inherent to just going out into the space, was that intentional, that Age of Sail kind of overlay, or is that just me being a history nerd and reading into it?
Yeah, they don't actually spend a lot of time with the interplanetary travel, but the Age of Sail thing, it really does come into play when they are in a system, because one of the things that I love to play with is the speed of light and acceleration that you're able to do, like just with powerful engines on a ship. And so I tried to keep all of that physics as realistic as possible as well. It's not this, well, I jump in here and I just pop on over to the other planet. No, you've got this acceleration time to get up to speed. You've got the deceleration at the end. And I play with that with my space combat, because if you shoot at somebody, yeah, space is big. There are lots of authors that have pointed out that idea and how it's difficult to deal with in some cases, but I wanted to take advantage of that. And so I've got cases where the relativistic effects really do come into play. And so it's not just the age of sail, it's the age of communication speed lagging as well as the ship's traveling.
Yeah, when you talked about the degrees matter if you're off by just a little bit. When I was one of my jobs in the Army, I was a bosun's mate. We called it watercraft operator. And when we're doing our navigation course, one of the things they point out is if you're aiming from, you're going out of the bay, the Chesapeake Bay, and you're aiming for London, say, because, we were one of the first colonies, if you're off by even a degree, you might end up in, South Africa by the time you get across the ocean, because, it compounds the farther from true you go. And now you magnify that interstellarly, and I can imagine not only would you end up in near the wrong planet, you might end up in the wrong solar system.
Right. Yeah, and if you're not careful, if you take too risky of a jump, well, that deflection might put you into the middle of a star. So
I was thinking of that too, as you just said that before you got to it. I was going to point that out, but so I do like that that you factor all that in. Before we start talking more about the universe, so what is the story of this art? I do notice that you use the same ship from various angles. So is this something that someone 3D rendered for you and then you made the covers, or is it stock image?
well, it is a 3D rendered ship because it's got the different angles of the ship. And so this set of 3 covers for the trilogy was actually a pre-made set of covers that I purchased as a bulk deal. And so an artist had put these together. They had the 3 different renderings of the ship. And so they put the background and the coloring on there. And then they just offered this up for sale on one of the cover sale sites. And so I stumbled across that and I thought, oh, that really does match nicely what I want to do. I mean, the ship design doesn't match really super well with the designs that I describe in the story, but I loved the way they had set it up with these covers. And so I bought that cover set. When you do that, you tell them, okay, here's where I want the title to be. Here's the subtitle. Here's the author name and positioning on. So I worked with the artist to get the final tweaks on that. And for instance, on this Discovery cover, the planet in the background originally didn't have a ring. And so I asked the artist, so can you put a ring on that? Because that is part of the story. And so she was able to customize the cover for me. And so it was a lot of fun to work with her to get these covers to where I wanted them.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique look to the ship. I mean, it's got almost the reverse saucer underneath that like you associate with Star Trek. It's got a unique bulbous shape to the front, which I just think is kind of cool. So is that something that you could get the STL file and actually 3D print if you wanted?
Yeah, if I could find the original source of that 3D rendering, yeah, I could print that. I've actually got a 3D printer in the other room here, and I've started designing things a little bit for that. But yeah, if I could find that model, maybe I could ask her where she got the model from, and if I could get a copy, whether she just bought it and licensed it or what she had done. I've also got a kit that I can use. It's got lots of components, and I could actually build a ship component-wise using Unity 3D graphics engine. So I've got all these things that I could play with, but there's only so much time in the day.
Definitely feel that one. All right, so before we get too deep into it, that's a cool story. You mentioned in the pre-show about the 4th cover that's out there. So did you want to, let's get that off the screen. Did you want to show us, I'm going to put you on solo so you can pull that out so people can see it.
Yeah, let's see how the green screen does here. So you can see there's the ship, the same ship. It's pulled from one of the 3 other covers, but I flipped the direction and then I put my own background on it. And so this is an omnibus, and so it's got books 1 through 3. And so I was able to use the resources that I had to put that together. So that I think it was the book 1 ship that I had flipped around. And so I recolored things. And so I was playing around with some of my Neanderthal graphics artist skills to get that cover put together. And so I was able to do that without too much pain and anguish. But now I have my omnibus version cover that matches the covers of my series.
Nice. How many words is the omnibus edition? Like, if you did a word count.
Let's see, probably about 280,000.
Okay, I know 350K is the maximum.
Yeah, and so each individual book, I think they're like 85 to 95. One of them might push a little bit higher, and so yeah, it's under 300,000 words.
Nice.
But
Did you add? for the omnibus, did you add any new content like short stories or anything like that, or is it just literally book 1 through 3?
It is just the same books 1 through 3. One fun thing that I did with each of the books is there's an appendix in the back. Being the tech nerd that I am, I kept a list of all of the bizarre things I had to look up as I was writing the story to get the science right. And so I wrote these little mini articles in the back of each of the books. And so all 3 of those appendices are in the back of the omnibus.
Cool. So what, because, we do have some people that listen to these episodes with their family because, they fostering nerddom across the generations, which I highly commend. But what age range would you say these stories are? If you're like using the movie theater kind of rating of G to R.
Well, I would definitely put them as a PG rating. I wouldn't hesitate to hand them to a teenager as long as they have a good reading level for comprehension.
Okay.
So a 12, 13-year-old, if they have the reading comprehension, they might be able to enjoy the story. One of the things that I have done in my publishing history, my fantasy series is published through a publisher, and they like to keep everything at a PG or milder. And so it's really nice because I know I can hand anything from that publisher to a kid and say, here, I think you'd enjoy the story, without me having to go through and figure out, oh, there's that one scene.
Okay, that makes sense. So that was by design. So do you use foul language, or do you substitute that out with made up curse words as in the trend with like frack instead of the other F word, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's another thing is I don't. Now, personally, that's not part of my vocabulary. And so when I write, it's also still not part of my vocabulary. And so, yeah, I will have cases in there where I will be describing that somebody was cursing. Okay, well, maybe that's as far as I take it. And so I try to keep it to be something a parent is not going to object to, even though I'm not specifically writing for kids most of the time.
Yeah, that's one of the things that you've got to factor in when you are. Hold on. One of my research tabs started a commercial for some reason. And I don't know if that went through or not, but I'm just like, oh, crap. So one of the things that when it comes to the writing, the curse words is you don't really think about it because, like, I grew up in a military family, joined the Army myself. I've heard words that would make some people blush, but then you have kids and you're like, well, crap, can I listen to this book in the car? Because I do most of my reading through audiobooks. Can I listen to this with my kids around? And that becomes a real consideration, even if you don't care yourself. And so it is always nice to kind of know what to expect, generally speaking, so you can be like, okay, I can't listen to this one when I'm carpooling with the kids or whatever. So I do appreciate that you were able to figure that out. Is that something that you just don't do generally? So you probably won't do in future books. If people check this out, an episode out, I'm like, yeah, let me check what else he's written, 2 years from now. Is that something that's generally on brand for you?
Yeah, that's just the way I write. The one thing to watch out for is the anthologies that I'm in. I only control my story in those anthologies. And so some of those could have content that's a little bit more spicy. But in general, PG-13 would be the limit on most of those as well. But it's just something to watch out for on some of those other short story collections, just because I'm not in control of that whole set.
That's fair. And that's true anytime, by the way, dear listener, anytime you're reading an anthology that your favorite author sent you to, is, you can only control, they can only control what they submitted. Now, some anthologies will have themed, like, I've seen some where they want military fiction, but they don't want gun prawn or, yes, I know I mispronounced that word for YouTube. They don't want that. They don't want graphic violence. There's certain things they just don't want. They don't want naughty, spicy stuff. They want you to fade to black. And so, but generally speaking, that anthology would tell you that in the blurb, if they have those kinds of restrictions. So it's a good point. And we don't say that often enough for people that like short content.
Yeah, one of my books, I actually did push the violence level just a little bit because there is some really interesting torture scenes because somebody's doing some scientific research in unpleasant ways. And so I like to kind of keep that as mild as I can with still getting the story points across.
Fair. So we started with the idea of you came up with the universe because you were trying to, fill a niche that you wanted but didn't find as a reader. But building on top of that, how did you come up with the larger idea for the plot of what became the Polecat Protocol, and where did the title even come from?
Well, there are a couple of questions involved in that. I liked the idea of the very rare fuel that had to be refined, and so I explored that a little bit. And that, okay, well, how do they get that fuel? Well, maybe they have to go out as space miners onto these little tiny distant moons that have the exact right profile to generate the raw materials that can be refined into this fuel. Okay, well, space mining is inherently dangerous, and dangerous and stories go together really well. And so that's how I got the setting for the story, is I decided it was going to be a set of space miners that are out there mining this fuel to ship it off to be refined. And so that kind of tied in really nicely with my overall universe design, because that fuel is a critical part of how space travel works. And so this gave a little bit more background into that universe just because of the way I set that up with the story.
So what is, that's the underpin for the universe. What is the general plot, theme, whatever? If you were giving an elevator pitch for this series, how would you sell it to someone who knows nothing about it other than they've seen the pictures?
I like stories of ordinary people stepping up to extraordinary circumstances. And so this is a case of people in danger who have to be very clever to survive. And so it's a theme of survival, but it's not your typical Braun saves the day kind of a story. I really like the idea of something that you have to think your way through. And so that theme is, well, yeah, being smart saves the day, but it takes more than that. It takes all of the actions and coordination and being a team player and all those sorts of things. I like that positivity in a story.
So is this a happy ending kind of story? Is it the grim dark where everyone dies in the end, a la George R.R. Martin? Like, how would you classify the story?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the grimdark. I really like the success stories where people win in the end. Sure, it's going to be a rough road to get there, but I like the happy endings.
Yeah, I don't mind dark settings, but I don't want grim dark, because I like knowing that there's a light at the end of the tunnel and it isn't the train about to run you over.
Right.
So I appreciate that in a story. Now, is this an action story? Is it like some sort of romance story?
Well, there is a romance running in the background, but it's not the main part of the story. It's also not a strictly action story. There are a lot of action sequences, but it's a little bit more of a character-driven thing where the good guys and the bad guys are in this cat and mouse kind of a situation. So it's a little bit mystery. It's a little bit of discovering what's going on. It starts off with the mining team being cut off through a disaster, and they think it's just some natural occurrence. Well, as they get into it, they discover otherwise, and so it turns into very much a survival story when they are being opposed. And so that sets up how the story plays out. And so very much a characters interacting is a big part of it, to where it's not just action scene after action scene like your typical race car movie or different things like that, or James Bond. How the opening sequence is just explosions constantly until it finally settles down. I'm a little bit more calm than that.
Okay. Now, where did you get the name the Polecat Protocol? Because that's a mouthful.
Yeah, Polecat Protocol. Well, it turns out, yeah, if you look at the back cover of the first book, the character Shanna Percival likes to stick her nose where it doesn't belong, and she discovers an information cache on this little moon that they are mining on. And this information cache has Black Ops research on it. And so I decided I was going to, like, skunk works is a term that relates to kind of off the books military development. And so the skunk works and polecat kind of played together on that. And so there's a little bit of back and forth on the terminology for that in the story as they're trying to discover, okay, what is this? How does it work? Can it help save us? And so the Polecat Protocol is how that cache of information got where it was to where she discovered it.
Okay. Works for me. So, you mentioned that this is a character-driven story. So what can you tell us about the main character?
Well, he starts out as, well, I need to do this one last job so that I can retire to a much safer place. He has a sister who is in a care facility, and he needs the money to help take care of her. And so he's in it just for the paycheck to get done and out. And of course, the universe has other plans for him.
So is he a young man? You've mentioned his sister's in a care facility, or is he an older guy at the twilight of his career?
I would put him like early 30s.
So he's a young man. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, fairly in the prime physically, because it's a very intensive labor process to go through all this mining. What happens with these miners is they are encased full time in a mechanized suit of armor that's like 15 feet tall. And so they do their mining while they are in these suits. It's like a suit of armor that you'd expect to be in a typical mech military sci-fi story, but they use it for mining. And so they are encased in these things full time. And so that's part of the risk, is they have these like 2-year stints that they'd go through in these suits. And so that's part of the challenge that they face is, okay, are we ever getting out of these suits? And so that I liked to play around with the science on that as well. So it plays into some of the little appendix pieces that I wrote for how all of that fun stuff works. And so there's a lot of these intricate little pieces that interact. And so I had a great time weaving all of that into that story.
So if they're living in these suits full time, how are they eating, sleeping, drinking, using the facilities?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I go over, because they have these goo tubes. They sort of plug it into their suit and suck this nutritional yet extremely bland gunk that they eat. And so, yeah, they are all tubed up inside these things. And so it's an entire waste processing facility built into their suits. So there's a chemical in there that keeps hair from growing, different things like that. So I like to tag just those little details here and there to give a flavor to the story. It's really important to not put things like that in as an info dump. So it's not like I have, well, here's the chapter where I detail all of the mechanical interfaces for the suit. You can't do that with a story.
Absolutely. Did you actually research the probability, I guess, of those suits? Is that something you looked into? I can't imagine. I can't imagine that's feasible as technology as we understand it, but I haven't obviously looked into it.
Yeah, some of the things that I looked at, like there's the perfluorocarbon oxygenated liquid that scientists experiment with. Drop a mouse in and it breathes the liquid and it runs around the bottom of the jar. And so I decided, okay, if they're going to be in these suits, that would protect them in the case of sudden accelerations, things like that. And so I integrated that in as part of that suit. One of the other challenges is if you're in an almost zero gravity environment, you have bone structure issues. And so just at one point in the story, I touch on how they have to have chemical supplements that address that issue. And so I try to hit those so that the scientists in the reading audience don't look at it and say, that's stupid, it wouldn't work that way, and just throw the book away. So I try to give a little bit of a hat tip toward the people that really know their science.
Now, sometimes there is a tendency when people write hard SF to basically they're writing science with a loose plot built around it because it's the science is the only thing that matters. Is this one where it's the science drives the plot, or did the plot drive the science as you used it?
Yeah, I don't like doing the pure rivet counting story where everything is subservient to the science, but I like to have the science be in their way when they are trying to accomplish things. And so it's very much the characters want to get something done, but some aspect of the science is in their way. And so I like that kind of an interaction.
Okay, so like the Diet Coke of hard sci-fi. Gotcha.
Well, yeah, I was thinking, well, this is kind of a hard sci-fi story, and my editor was telling me, you've got a lot of space opera in there too, and so it's kind of this mix of the two, and so it's not really purely one or the other, and so it tries to, the story straddles that middle ground where I have the character interactions, but I like to get my details right.
Okay. So you happy middle ground for people that aren't normally like the hard SF guys.
Right.
That makes sense. I dig it. So you mentioned you shared some of that research. Is that what was going in the appendices?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, I've got a lot of interesting things in there. Like in the first book, I have a page on the orbital mechanics of the moon that they are on, like how fast it's rotating, the gravity level, all the different things. Like if you are this far above the surface, that takes this long to orbit it because there's a little space station hanging out up there. Microgravity versus free fall. I've got the perfluorocarbon liquid in there. I even have one on Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how that plays into what the miners are going through. How much energy is in a terajoule because they have these battery packs that their suits use. All of the there's a fun story about surviving in a vacuum. There was a NASA researcher who was in a vacuum chamber on the ground, so it wasn't in space, but his suit lost a seal, and so he was suddenly exposed to a vacuum. And so they hit the emergency buttons and they repressurized the area he was in. But before they could do that, he passed out. And he said that the last thing he remembered was his spit boiling. And so, of course, that had to go into the story. Absolutely. They did some experiments on that, what it would be like living in some of those domed cities that you expect of some of our first colonies as well. It was out in Arizona, the domed whatever. Oh, right.
They lived in for 2 different times tried to live there for a year. I don't know how good the science of it is going to be, at least from the hard science, just because they found out they didn't factor in the drying of the cement and the air circulation. So they actually had to pump in air. And so it wasn't as self-contained as they thought. But as far as like the science of people living and, only eating what they could grow and all that, I think that and the psychological impact was pretty interesting. There's a couple books about it, about the people that survived well, obviously they all did survive, but like people that were on the experiment have written books, so they definitely took factions, and it's definitely interesting. And now they use it to control the environment, so they can test like natural phenomenon inside of there. So they have like a faux ocean that moves and all the ecosystems. But
right,
it's cool to see what they're doing now to test the science that might make the books you're writing reality, which I think is just fascinating.
Yeah, something like that can play into things like terraforming if you take it to a much larger scale.
Yes. And then there's the futurist Michio Kaku or something. I'm trying to blank on the guy's name. Who's he did a lot of the what do you call futurism stuff, like where he predicts what the future might be.
Yeah, I think I've got one of his books.
Dr. Michio, Michio Kaku, Kaku. Who's a physicist and a futurist, famous for his Quantum Supremacy novel, which I've read. But he is very hopeful, which I dig. But he puts the science behind it. So was that kind of stuff what you were looking at when you were writing this?
Yeah, it's just when I came across something where I didn't know the answer off the top of my head, I thought, okay, well, let's find out how this thing works. And so every time I would come across one of those roadblocks, typically that's a horrible thing for a writer to run into something and think, oh, I need to look up some research now, because research rabbit holes happen and you surface 3 days later and realize you've got nothing. But I wanted to make sure I had that feature down, and so I would at least make a note saying I need to look this up for this part of the story. And so that's kind of how those appendices came to be, is I would just come across something. But it comes down to what we were talking about earlier with reading very widely, because if you read a lot of different things, I keep up on a lot of scientific research just as a hobby. And so having that background makes it easier for me to do that, because I can pick the pieces that I want to interact. And if you don't know those pieces are there, you can't do it. I mean, words and ideas have power. And if you don't know those words and ideas, then you are handicapped. You can't express yourself in areas related to those things. It's like the whole idea of dark matter. That's something that the scientists defined because they had this hole in their equation and decided, okay, I need something to fill in here so that the math works. We'll call it dark matter and dark energy, because they don't know what it is. But now that we have that term, we can talk about those things in more concrete conversations.
So is this story set in the near future? How far into the ahead are we? Because we're obviously not where the story is taking place tech-wise.
Yeah, I don't have a specific year, but it's like at least 100, 200 years ahead, where we have interplanetary space flight. There's been a lot of advances, but they do later in the trilogy get back to Earth, which is still the home of humanity and where everything is happening. And so it's kind of you don't have the far distant future effect like some stories do. It is still a recognizable Earth. And so, yeah, a couple hundred years into the future is about what I was shooting for.
So is the people putting the miners out there to check for the mineral that makes the gas, are they privatized companies? Are they part of a nation state in that it's official expedition? Like, what is the underlying political structure from a story perspective?
Yeah, from the story, that is a company doing that research. And that actually plays into the story in the second and third book for how that company is involved and what they are doing. And so it has a little bit of a political machinations element to it as that gets involved later in the trilogy.
Now, was it always intended to be a trilogy? Do you think you might come back and revisit this later, this universe?
Well, the universe, I would love to write something else. I've had a couple of fans point out, you've got this opening here where you could do something else. If I write more in it, it's going to be more standalone. I could either do a standalone novel or another standalone trilogy, so you wouldn't have to read the first one to understand the second one. But yeah, I'm looking at that as one of the things on my list that I want to write. It's a growing list.
Yeah, it always amazes me when people ask authors, like, where do you get your ideas? I'm like, no, ma'am. The question is, how do you turn them off? I've never written a short story that I couldn't envision a 12-book arc for.
There's the idea fairy. You always have to dodge the idea fairy so that you don't get blessed with 12 new ideas while you're trying to finish the first one.
Well, with my brain issue, I don't really have that problem. I'll forget stuff. But the other part of that is, you're convinced you had this brilliant idea and then your mind goes blank. I'm like, well, crap, I guess it wasn't that brilliant after all. So, there's value in just writing it down and moving on. So you mentioned that it's about 200 years in the future. There's nation states still exist. Are any of the planets independent polities, or are they all tied to Earth still?
That's part of the story. Is some of them are trying to break away. They don't want to be under the government. They don't want to be corporate owned. They want to be on their own. And so that ties into the story and how the settled planets are, they're all very low population because you can't ship a lot of people. You've got billions of people on Earth. How many ships is it going to take to get people somewhere? And if the fuel is really expensive, that's not a good option. So all of these outposts where they're trying to do their terraforming and whatever else are very low population, isolated places, but they want to make their own independent go of it. And so some of them really do have the backing of the government or the corporations. And so we've got these different factions that are all interplaying there.
Okay. Now, do you have like cloning tech or artificial wombs or something that would allow population booms on the other side? Because it's one of the things you need if you want to thrive in colony. You need to, rise above your birth rate. So every paired couple would need at least 2 kids to break even, and 3+ if you want to grow your population. There is speculation that we aren't too far away from artificial wombs. So is that something you play with as far as the technology? Because I do imagine we're going to need to do something to speed up our repopulation of the stars.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I have one character who is using that technology to build a cattle ranch. So that's a little bit later in the book. And so there's also the idea of, if you have this collection of embryos, for instance, and you want to make sure that they are genetically sound, if you have the technology to go in and tweak the genes and adjust things, like to cure diseases before someone is born, that actually plays into it as well. The main character's sister, who is in a care facility, comes into this as well. Like, there's a doctor that comes into the story a little bit later, and how his research is working toward finding a cure for her. So lots of different things on genetics and how that works, and how you can repopulate, whether it's through the people or the large animals that you can't just put on a spaceship, all of those sorts of things. And so I like having a world that's filled out enough to where those sorts of questions have answers, instead of, well, I didn't think of that. It's a case of, okay, how would I do that? And yes, some of that does play into the story. And so if you have somebody who's out to sabotage my rancher, they can do that technologically rather than playing old school wrestler and running the herd off.
We actually have some of that technology with the CRISPR stuff. The problem is we don't understand the genes enough to make it efficient. I know a couple of years ago, there was a Chinese doctor that experimented when he was doing IVF on the babies, because he wanted to make them AIDS resistant. But he didn't ask permission from the families. We don't really know what happened to the kid, and he just sort of disappeared. And I imagine at some point his family was given the bill for the bullet, because it's sort of how the CCP rolls. But I mean, if we're able to do that now, 200 years, one would think, assuming some sort of ethical consideration doesn't stop the research, they're going to actually make that more viable to be standard, as opposed to, holy crap, I hope I don't, make them grow an extra leg or something.
Yeah, with retroviruses, they can go in and you can have something that will do gene splicing. And some of that technology does exist. It's just, like you were saying, we don't know what gene to splice in a lot of cases.
And then the other part of that is, that might provide the solution. So I grew up, I loved watching Stargate. Well, I watched it when I was a little bit older, because it came out when I was older. But I loved that series. But it, like many of the Star Trek stuff, you'd go to a planet and there's so few people there that there's no way they have enough biodiversity from a genetic point of view that they're not running into everybody's related to everybody. And this is a, inbreeding compound, right? Because you need anywhere, the estimate range from anywhere to 500 to 5,000 separate genetic codes that you would need to mix it up. Now you can get around some of that. Like you said, with the IVF, you just, send the created genes. You hope that radiation and travel doesn't damage them, and, rock and roll on the other side. But the argument I hear sometimes people, well, if we're good enough to get them to here, then presumably we're good enough. We've already solved that problem. But it's not something a lot of sci-fi even thinks about to make a head nod one way or the other, which I think is just a missed opportunity.
Yeah, that's one of those things that I decided, I can integrate genetics into the story. I'm not a genetics expert, but I know how to do Google Foo. And so I can look up a bunch of these things. If you're looking up scientific articles on the web, you tend to get better answers than if you're looking up political questions on the web. And so you can do a lot of interesting research that way. And so, depending on how you're asking your questions and what you're asking about, research can go either complete blithering idiocy, or it can be some really cool tech.
Yeah, the trick is for most people who aren't scientifically literate, you stick to reading the white papers, which is generally the summary. You miss some of the nuance, but you get the broad points. Mm-hmm. I think I read a lot of the white papers just because some of that stuff is too math intensive, and I'm like, my eyes will glaze over. I just need to know the end result. And we're going to see some of that with that one astronaut that was stayed in the space station for a year, and then his twin brother didn't, and now they're comparing them afterwards. I think that kind of study is going to lead us, down that line of advancement. Now, these ships, do they have artificial gravity, since you're trying to stick to the science?
No, I don't use artificial gravity. That's a thing that I appreciated about Chris Kennedy Publishing and their Four Horsemen universes. That is the prime rule nobody is ever allowed to mess with, is there is no artificial gravity. And so I kind of adopted that in. And so if you want gravity, you have to spin something.
I mean, if it's not tied to a planet, technically the spinning, which you're talking about, the habitat you can do with centrifugal force to create gravity, that's not artificial gravity. So I wonder if that would count as an end run for the Four Horsemen. But
you can use that, but there is nothing where you just flip a switch and you have gravity.
The reason you see that kind of stuff in science fiction and you see the small populations at the various planets is mostly a budgetary consideration. You don't have that as much of a problem with the CGI ability to do things. Hopefully you do a lot better than Rings of Power did. I think Netflix put that out, or maybe it was Amazon Prime, where like one of the scenes they're on this island and they're using the AI or the green screen cloning to make the population bigger than the 15 person mob they had. But then you see like the same guy a bunch of times in the exact same outfit. I'm like, oh, I know what you did here. But fiction in print, you're not limited to that. You can do whatever you want because it's just words to describe. Are there any other hard and fast science rules that you either insisted sticking to or you intentionally ignored?
I decided that the speed of light really is important. And acceleration rates are really important because I like messing with those and seeing how I can make things difficult for people based on that, where, I'm looking at something, but what happened isn't going to reach me until the light reaches me from that incident. And so those sorts of things I pay a lot of attention to because it helps me on the timing of how people get to where they need to be when they need to be there.
Okay, makes sense. I tend to stick with the school of hand wavium. Star Trek taught me one thing: all you got to do is divert and invert the polarity of the dilithium crystals, and you can pretty much solve everything. Although I do appreciate when people make a nod to the science, even if it's not hard sci-fi. At least acknowledge that there is some science behind it.
Yeah, you can't overwhelm the reader with it. And so even in one point, I have the smart character explaining something to the dumb character, and they start into it, and the dumb character says, I don't need to know that. And so that way the reader can see, oh, yeah, well, I don't need to know it either, except that they think it's important. And so I don't get to take the time to go into the huge levels of detail to explain everything, because that's boring.
Speaking of not being boring, do you have aliens in this universe, or is it all Homo sapien centric?
It is all people.
Okay.
They haven't expanded far enough to discover anything else. Now, I've been thinking that maybe that's what I do with the follow-on stories.
Okay. That would be interesting. I do enjoy a good, alien story. Was that by design that you intentionally kept the aliens out?
That was more of a simplifying step. Just narrowing down the scope. You can't put a whole bunch of changes into a story and get them to work, unless, of course, you're Frank Herbert writing Dune, and then it's you've got all the witchcraft and the all the other things playing in with the science, and you've got spice. He's got like 40 more things than most authors can get away with. So I had to keep my scope narrowed down at least a little bit, and that's one of the ways of doing that.
Now, obviously, you do have some form of alien life in that when they get to these planets, they found plants and algae, maybe, the building blocks of something. But most people, when we say alien, what we really mean is sentient or sapient, I guess,
right?
Aliens, as opposed to, flora and fauna and herd stock.
Right.
When they get to these alien planet or these foreign planets, these, post-Terran settlements, do they find vegetation and natural wildlife, or is even that not there?
I haven't got any wildlife, and so at this point, that it's all something they have to just import with them, and so there's no competition for that. And so I've kind of approached it from that direction, but that does give me the flexibility of, well, they just haven't found the right place yet.
So are we talking dome cities, or have they terraformed places?
Well, the ones that I have that they are visiting, the atmosphere is at least breathable already, even if there's nothing growing, or if there is a little bit of vegetation, it's all incompatible. And so it's a matter of them needing to start from the ground up, building the ecology of how everything plays together. And so, okay, at what point do we actually put mosquitoes into the environment, and do we really want to?
Yeah, mosquitoes are the devil. In some places in the South, they are big enough to carry away small children. I'm joking, people. That's not serious, but that we're constantly developing technology which could be used to facilitate that. Like, there's a plan right now. So obviously you're probably aware that Africa has a fissure that it's going to potentially in the next million years split off and become an archipelago. There's been some recent studies about it, with it opening up. And one of the plans was to speed that up. Now, they wanted to use nuclear, which I think is stupid because, it's nuclear, but, potentially turning that fissure into an ocean in a lifetime as opposed to in, a lifetime of lifetimes. When that happens, part of that research, they're finding ways to make what they call liquid trees. Have you seen the science for that?
I haven't.
Basically, it's a giant tank with a fan that lets it suck ambient air in and forces the end product back out. And it's got algae in it and some other chemicals, and it basically scrubs CO2 out of the environment, much like a forest would. But you get the equivalent of a forest in this one stack. So if the technology is progressing, and then I don't know how, it's hard sometimes to tell what's a legitimate scientific breakthrough when you're seeing the model and how much of that's just clickbait nonsense. Especially since obviously they're not going to tell you how they did everything, because proprietary stuff is proprietary for a reason. But the idea is people are starting to think of terraforming more realistically. Now, did you play with, colonies on things like gas giants? Because, that is something we're toying with now as, could we make that happen?
Yeah, with something like a gas giant, the original mining moon is orbiting a gas giant. And the gas giant is a very large, unfriendly thing with high gravity. And so it's kind of one of those things where, yeah, if you want to zip in and scoop some of the atmosphere in a close pass, yeah, you could probably do that, but you're not going to get any closer than that because it's high gravity and very dangerous. And if you get too much drag, you go in and you never come out. And so I like the idea of having the variety there of the different kinds of planets. And so I play around with that. But yeah, the big ones are dangerous.
They have been toying with the idea, at least conceptually, about using Cloud City type deals from Star Trek or Star Wars, excuse me. Don't worry, I'll say a few hail George Lucas, and I'll be okay in the world. But basically cities that float because the way the gas giants work. Now, if the gravity on that's too high, obviously that doesn't work anymore. But there's definitely been considerations that we don't necessarily need Earth 2.0 to be able to build a colony there.
Right. Yeah, and if you have good shielding, you can do whatever you need to in orbit as long as you have the raw materials. And so, yeah, building space stations out of things like the asteroid debris, the metals that you can find in space, you need to go where your resources are plentiful to be able to build anything. So on the surface, you build out of surface materials. Out in space, you have to build out of materials that are there. Getting things out of the gravity well is astoundingly expensive. And so keeping that in mind is important for kind of the rivet counting hard science fiction contingency, because you just can't lift that much out of orbit, out of the gravity well into orbit to be able to build these huge mega structures.
Now, have you looked into using the concept of the space elevators to make stuff happen?
I haven't used the space elevators. To me, they just feel too much like a terrorist target.
They potentially could be. But I mean, anything in the space industry that's vital, and all of it's vital if you want to survive in the void, becomes a target as well. And I imagine there are easier soft targets. Now, if we're going through space, obviously we have micrometeorites and small degrees that can cause a lot of damage. Even a grain of sand, if you're going fast enough, it'll cut through one end of the ship and out the other. So do you develop shielding in this universe as far as tech goes, or do you just rely on extra thick plating that constantly gets repaired?
Yeah, I don't have the concept of the shields where you turn it on and, oh, yeah, our shields that are 100%. And I don't use that kind of shielding. And so it's all ablative stuff where, yeah, it wears out over time because of the material that you're flying through. Even though it's really sparse, yeah, it will wear through your ship. And so that's the direction I've gone with that. That's a little bit leaning more into the hard sci-fi rather than the space opera, to not have those shields that you just turn on and off.
It also gives you the ability to get that junker vibe, because if you take a ship that's just a little bit older, when you do the repairs, if you're not from money, you end up with patchwork. This metal over here, it fits the size, it works great, but just doesn't look pretty. And you can kind of give yourself that vibe just by the ability to do repairs in that sense, which would be realistic, because it takes a lot of money to maintain consistency of like think about all the time our Navy spends painting the holes, the hull, HULL. So with this universe, you mentioned the main characters. Are there any secondary characters that you specifically really dig?
Well, in most of my stories, I tend to write a sidekick who has mental stability issues. And so, yeah, I've got that going on here. It kind of started with my fantasy series. I've got what ended up being my editor's favorite character, just because he's more colorful, because he doesn't have the constraints that society normally puts on people. And so I've kind of done the same thing here, where there's the sidekick character. He's the one who decides he wants to start a cattle ranch because he really loves steak.
It's a valid concern.
And so, yeah, he's the kind of loose nut in the machine.
So are there any? Is this a man versus the environment versus nature type story? Is there some big baddie that they have to overcome?
The big bad is going to be other people. The environment just adds a little bit of stress and interest to what's going on and gives them some constraints. And so, yeah, even in the first book where they are battling very much the environment that they are in, it's caused by people.
Okay. Was there anything else about the Polecat Protocol that we didn't ask that you think the audience needs to know?
Well, I think we've been able to hit it from a lot of different angles. Yeah, I love the stories about, like I mentioned right up front, of ordinary people stepping up to extraordinary circumstances. It's a different feel from things like The Chosen One kind of a story that you see so much in fantasy. And I like that because it tells people, even if you are an ordinary person, you can step up to do extraordinary things. And so that's one of the reasons why I do things that way and why I like that kind of a story. And so you'll be able to find that kind of a theme in almost everything that I write.
Okay. And if people wanted to check out this book, links will be in the show notes, but how can they check you out?
Well, I do have a website that I have put together, mostly a little bit of a blog, things like that. If you look for johnmolsen.blogspot.com, that will take you to my blog there. At the very top, there is a mailing list and giveaway sign up, so you can join my mailing list and you will get a monthly announcement of what's going on in my life, reviewing other books, and events that I'm going to be going to, things like that. If you follow me on Amazon, you will also get notifications every time something that I either write or participate in, like an anthology, anytime one of those is released. And so if you're looking for me on Amazon, the easiest way is to search for Olsen as well as Polecat Protocol. But if you're searching for my name, including the M in the middle, John M Olsen, will filter out the other billions of John Olsens the world seems to have lurking in the corners.
All right. And this is the part of the interview where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book. So do your part, people. And with that, you can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree / Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, Linktree / Blasters and Blades Podcast, where we link to all the things, the bits, shoots, the rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, maybe the Spotify, the Twitter. We have our Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. We have our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, Blasters and Blades Podcast @gmail.com. For professional purposes only, people. Keep the shenanigans. I'm Stabby Stab on our Instagram, Twitter, and our email. You can support the show at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it's for the podcast. And I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee goodness until they float away on a river of Java. And if you want some of that experience for yourself, click the links in the show notes. Use the code PodcastGrunts. You get 10% off. We get a little bit of a kickback. It's a win-win, and you shop local. I would go on that soapbox, but they took it away from me because they said it bores you. So instead, I'll say thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades Podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. All right, thanks for coming on, John. This was a lot of fun.
Glad to be here.
All right, and with that, we're going to hit the end button. Don't cuss yet. Wait for it.